Let's take a look at dashboards and scorecards as we use them in systems engineering. It's a heuristic, so there's a lot of overlap here, and it's a loose concept, so don't get overly constrained thinking about how to design one of these things. It's an analytical tool for making sure that the components of our system engineering have in them the quantification and metrics desired at the level of systems engineering. So the basic distinction in this heuristic is that a dashboard is a display that's visible to the operator of a process. Some data, some information make available to someone who's using a component of your system or being a component of your system, such that they could tune their process accordingly. So it's very tactical, it's very internal. It's really focused on the current snapshot, what's happening right now that I might want to do differently. So what is my focus in terms of my process? How do we help people do something better that they're already doing within our system? That's the dashboard. So is everything functioning as we expect it to do and to design to do? Are we meeting the requirements? It's a very internal view, as opposed to a scorecard, which is a more strategic external view of usually one of our stakeholders wanting to ask, what's the score? Who's winning? Okay, are there components of your system we should be looking at? What are the contributions to that? So external stakeholders tend to evaluate your system and your processes more strategically and more externally. So they're often interested in historical time series with an organizational focus, kind of how are we doing? So are the functions of the system driving the desired outcomes, and are we pursuing the right requirements? Now there's overlap here obviously, because any internal view that we put on a dashboard might be of interest as a time series historically to someone looking at the scorecards. There's certainly overlap across the two, but we use the term dashboard when we're talking about metrics we're creating for the purpose of the person or people in the process who want to tune their behaviors or react in some way. The scorecard being an external view where our stakeholders, usually after the fact, sometimes in real time, but usually after the fact, are evaluating our systems and processes as we go through. So if I just look at some quick examples of dashboards versus scorecards, we could look at the dashboard for baseball. The umpire is calling balls and strikes, and it matters to a batter what the balls and strikes are. The pitchers care about their pitch mix and velocity and placement, and how many wild pitches have they thrown, and how many batters have they hit. In terms of what's going on. On the scorecard, we look at the runs and hits and the walks, the errors, the earned run averages, how many players have been ejected. And yes, individual metrics could show up on either side of this score. My number of wild pitches thrown by a pitcher could be very important to someone, a pitching coach's scorecard of that pitcher. So we're not trying to delineate categories here that can never cross over. We're focused on the types of measures that are useful in those kinds of circumstances. If I move down to the second example here, your dashboard in your car shows you your speedometer, your odometer, your oil pressure light, your fuel gauge. That's information the driver should have in the car to be able to drive the car better or properly. Would you want to drive a car that doesn't tell you that information as you go through? As opposed to your scorecard, maybe how often you arrive at work on time, or how many speeding tickets you've received, or how many traffic accidents you've taken, or how many times you've broken down. So your boss at work is issuing a scorecard on whether you arrive on time or not. Your insurance company is keeping a scorecard on you to see how many tickets you get and how many accidents you're in. So external stakeholders tend to look at scorecards, and internal operators tend to work at dashboards. The third example here is rather dated, but it's back in the days when I used a video rental store as one of my examples. So the dashboard in a video rental store might be how often a customer walks out without renting something, the abandon rate, how long it takes to put the returns back on the shelf in terms of cycle time, how many damaged tapes there might be, and how many requests I'm able to actually fulfill on behalf of a customer. Those might be dashboard metrics that tell the employees in the store if they're doing things right, as opposed to management scorecard, which might look at how many visits are they receiving per hour, how many stock turns are they getting by category, how much money are they owed by the age of the member, how fresh is my inventory across the whole store. So dashboards more tactical and used by the operator, scorecards more strategic and used by the stakeholders to evaluate the system. This all comes under the heading of what we call augmentation of our systems, as opposed to automation. An automation project takes the function or the component and simply makes it work. So the example on this slide is taking an order, the output of which is a valid order. If all I care about is automating the system not in the IT sense, but in the engineering sense, if I just want to make the process take valid orders, I don't need dashboards or scorecards. So you can define your system requirements without ever mentioning a dashboard or a scorecard, unless there's a very specific circumstance where they might arise based on your stakeholder requirements. The ones we're talking about here are the ones we put in because we're systems engineers, not because our stakeholders are asking for them. So we talk in terms of augmenting the system. If the base system you would create is called the automation project, so taking orders creates valid orders, then we add to that to further augment the process, to make it better, to make it stronger, to make it more reliable. So we do a few things when we do that. One is every component of every system, you should be challenging yourself to say, what would the dashboard be? So if my taking orders needs to have a dashboard, I'll call it the order entry dashboard as a potential output. Every function, every component of every system, you should be thinking in terms of how does it contribute to the scorecard. Now, not every component needs a scorecard, obviously, but where it matters, we might say that taking orders is implementing part of the customer service function, and we want to have a customer service dashboard available to the stakeholders that are interested in that. So the question becomes, what can take orders contribute to the customer service scorecard as we go through? On the dashboard side, we might look at the response and cycle times for accepting orders, how many screens are required to do it if this is an IT type automated system, any remote processing demand, how often do we have to ask someone else to do processing on behalf of our orders, maybe our network bandwidth, our pop-up conditions, how many were encountered while taking the order, how many help functions were invoked, how many field errors by type are taking place during the taking the order. So how is our operator actually doing on using our take order automated function to capture valid orders, as opposed to management's view on the customer service side of how many pickup rings and abandon rates do we have associated with order entry? What's the cycle time per transaction? How many transactions are we handling per hour? And what are their error rates? How satisfied are my customers? How many callbacks do I have to make per transaction to finally complete an order? And how often am I having to handle exceptions in my process, either with or without supervisor intervention? So again, these metrics can cross over and be used on each. But as systems engineers, we should be thinking in these terms on every system we get involved with as we go our way through. So it's not just a matter of what does our stakeholder want or what does our operator want, it's how can we make the system better. If we don't have a dashboard metric built into our process, then how can the process be designed to pay attention and do things differently? So my dashboard for my taking of orders might notice that my cycle times are getting longer. And it's getting harder and harder to take my orders. So when cycle times start to get longer and longer, maybe my function should respond by bringing in more sales clerks. If my cycle times are very, very short or my processing demands are very, very low, maybe I could reduce the amount of capacity I have in my system. So how will you build a smart system that can adjust to the realities in real time of the circumstances if you don't think in terms of dashboard metric? Remember, dashboard metric doesn't necessarily have to be seen by a human to be useful. You could design your system to respond to these metrics with or without any kind of operator intervention as you go through. So the dashboard is very, very important. The scorecard is very, very important. If you don't have this kind of data coming out of your process, I would argue that you're not really doing systems engineering. You're just doing process improvement and automation on behalf of your stakeholders. That might be what they need or want, but if you're not designing in metrics and designing in controls, you really shouldn't be claiming that you're doing systems engineering. So that's basically the process of augmentation. It requires you to know the units that you're processing, because if the unit of measure and all these measures can be tough to work out. On this particular example, taking orders, we said that the unit of interest is the actual individual product, the SKU, from a given warehouse via a shipment on a given date. So a single order that's requesting one thing from one warehouse on one day might be considered an order. But another order that takes 10 different products on 3 different warehouses and 10 different shipments on 4 different days, much more complicated order, is considered a much larger unit for the sake of the process. So you've got to decide how you're going to count things when you're doing them on dashboards and scorecards to make sure that the unit of measure is consistent across all use of your system. So in this case, the unit metrics might be the unit counts or value or volume. You can count three things. I can count the orders. I can measure how many products they're moving in terms of volume, or maybe the dollar value associated with them. So some of these metrics would weight the more valuable or more expensive items more heavily. So the unit of the counts, the value, the volume, usually segmented by order or customer or product or warehouse or data, whatever else other way you might want to slice and dice your data. And you might also want to segment it by the service rep who's doing the transaction, or the transaction type, or the time period. Friday nights might be something you want to measure. So units being counted, valued, or volumed by the type of data you're interested in and by the organizational transaction type you're working on. Something along those lines is going to be needed for each of the measures you try to stipulate on your dashboard or scorecard. So when you're building scorecards, things we like to do with our scorecards is typically we want our scorecard to help our stakeholders map our process capability to the voice of the customer. So the stakeholder looking at the scorecard or being told what these metrics are should be able to know whether the system is truly meeting their requirements or not and solving the problem they were interested in. So we want to track critical to quality metrics and provide some kind of a basis through the scorecard for organizational improvement and maturity. The metrics that are tracked, typically we look at defects and defective data, defect per unit or Sigma score if you're in the Six Sigma world. We might have the weighted quality function deployment measures and transfer functions from our QFD analysis a few weeks ago. We're generally leading indicators of what's happening. If you're designing a 911 operator system, you might want your scorecard to track calls by weather types. So we know that certain weather types are leading indicators of problems in the 911 system or opportunities in the 911 system. So we might want to focus our scorecards on the design of our system, the processes that is implementing, or the organization as a whole. It's going to depend upon who those stakeholders are and what their stake is in your system. Because ideally we want to be able to use all this kind of data to determine the gaps between the requirements and the capabilities of the system we've built, to determine the effectiveness of the process steps and components that we've designed, and to identify indicators for future improvements and actions as we go through. So defining those scorecards and dashboards into your system so that your system not only tracks the data and creates the dashboards and scorecard, but ideally your system is intended and designed to actually respond to the measures that are there. So the things people would do when they see the scorecard, if they come back to you and ask for changes, hopefully those are in fact functions in your system that they can then exercise. We're not talking about data in your system that someone can go write a report or read a database to get, because then you're saying it's outside of your system. So include these functions in your system as you go, and then you'll be able to claim, yes, we've been doing systems engineering.